BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today This Week podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, muck, paperwork and electricity. We'll discuss the impact of intensive pig and poultry farming on the countryside.
What we need to see is far more support for these pig and poultry farmers, because at the moment they're really not in a position to make better, more sustainable choices.
Hear that EU border checks and paperwork for British food exporters will last until 2027.
I'm just disappointed that the length of time it's taking. Exports are down. Agri-food exports from the UK are 20% down since Brexit. There's weed growing in the yard.
And join the rural community finally connected to mains electricity.
Hair straighteners, I wouldn't dare put them on if the kettle was on.
As soon as I finished work, I was straight up and it was flick the light switch and I'm like, so is that off the mains, not the generator?
More on that later. Let's start, though, with pollinators. We talked about them all this week on our sister programme, Farming Today, every weekday morning here on BBC Radio 4 at 5:45, which I acknowledge is a bit early, which is why we have the highlights here every Saturday morning. Or you can listen on BBC Sounds. End of advert. Back to pollinators, which, as we'll hear, come in many shapes and sizes, but most of us still first think bees. Catherine and Chris Price grow a variety of fruits on their farm in Herefordshire, including cider apples, cherries, blueberries, raspberries and strawberries. In recent years, the couple have been increasing the bee population on the farm to improve yields, as Bob Huckenhall reports.
We're next to a box. You've got about 40 of these, and they've been imported from Holland, containing bees.
When we get the bees arrive on farm, we unbox them. So each beehive is in an individual cardboard container, and then we build the sides, which provides a ventilation into the beehive. Then within that, you've got a plastic inner, which is where you've got the worker bees. So depending on the size of the hive, you've got between 110 and 200 what they call worker bees. So these are bumblebees that come in and aid in the pollination. And so below them in the box, you can see here we've got a pollen reserve, really, or a nectar reserve. So it's a liquid with a wick that gives them that early boost of food should they arrive on farm and the crops not be in full blossom. It gives them a backup of feed to keep them going early on.
So what are the advantages of importing bees like this?
So we import them because we've got a number of tunnel crops here. So typically your honeybee, which is your standard beekeeper bee, doesn't like to fly in the cooler conditions. And obviously it's very difficult to predict in the spring the weather we're going to get. So we import some bumblebees that are happier to operate and pollinate in much cooler conditions.
How have they performed this year so far?
Well, compared to last year, which was a particularly cold spring and wasn't great weather, the bees have been much better this year, and we've had a really good pollination across all our crops.
These bees do come from Holland. Does that cause any threats to our native bees here?
So the bees within these hives, they are actually UK native bees. So they are Bombus terrestrius. So they do fit in nicely within our sort of the wild bee population and don't cause any issues.
Away from the tunnel crops, Catherine's husband Chris is watching the honeybees at work.
The main peak is March, April, when a lot of our crops are in blossom. So a local beekeeper brings his hives in. So we have a peak of about 60 hives then, and he gradually removes them once our crops have finished pollinating.
And earlier I was talking with Catherine about the commercial bees that come in from Holland. Do they compete with the wild pollinators? Do they cause any problems in that way?
As far as I can see, I don't think they compete at all. I think they benefit each other. We find that the imported bees, the bumblebees, work better when it's cooler. So in a colder spring, the bumblebees come into effect, but then a warmer spring, the honeybees tend to do a very good job. So I think by using two types of bees or more, it helps to spread your risk for pollination.
Chris Price in Herefordshire. Bees are not, of course, the only pollinators. Paul Hetherington from the insect charity Bug Life ran me through some of the others.
There's a whole raft of animals that carry out pollination. A lot of the flies, particularly things like hoverflies, a whole range of bees, bumblebees, solitary bees, and of course honeybees. And then you've got things like butterflies, you've got moths, you've got wasps, but also quite a number of beetles, the thick-legged flower beetle and the pollen beetle.
How would you describe the current situation for pollinators here in the UK?
We're very concerned about the state of particularly our wild pollinators. There have been definitive declines in numbers over the last sort of 20 odd years. We have a survey that measures total insect abundance, and it's shown a 63% fall in abundance since 2021. Now, this year's survey is still underway, and at the moment it is looking encouraging that things are slightly better than last year. And that's to be expected because of the way the weather's picked up.
Over the past number of years now, we've had a lot of farmers being paid by taxpayers to create more habitat for things like pollinators. Has that had any effect?
You would hope it's had some effect, but a lot of farmers are using chemicals on their fields, herbicides in particular, and that is taking away a lot of the forage that's available. Also, of course, pesticides, which can impact on our wild pollinators. And, of course, also the bringing in of too many honeybee hives can also have a very detrimental effect. You need to create around 10 hectares of pollen-rich habitat for every hive of honeybees you bring in. Otherwise, what they will be doing is taking away from what's available for the wild.
We heard just now a company which actually imports their own bumblebees in this case to work in polytunnels. Is that one of the solutions to the problems we've faced?
I know this is something that's been done quite a lot, but again, it's in polytunnels because the problem is you're bringing in pollinators from overseas. They could well be carrying diseases that could wreak havoc really amongst our wild populations in the UK.
What do we need to do to try and make life easier for pollinators?
We need to create more connectivity. This is the biggest problem. You've lost loads and loads of habitat, but what habitat you've got is so fragmented that you can't get between areas of good habitat. So then if something catastrophic happens, you're going to lose everything in the area. So we've developed a system called beelines, which are, if you like, pollinator superhighways. And that's what we need to do. We need to start getting that connectivity back so that pollinators can travel between places.
Paul Hetherington from BugLife. The pig and poultry industry is damaging our rivers and countryside. Well, that's according to a new report commissioned by the Wildlife Trusts. The UK produces almost 1 million tonnes of pig meat and 2 million tonnes of poultry meat every year, and the trusts have been examining the broader environmental risk from intensive farming. Over the past few years, there have been rows about the impact on rivers, for instance the Wye, but the Trust's report assesses the wider implications for land use and wildlife. It highlights the scale of intensive production and the use of land for producing feed, as well as the waste that comes from the farms. Barnaby Coop from the Wildlife Trusts told Kaz Graham the concentration of intensive pig and poultry farms in small geographical areas, like pigs in parts of East Yorkshire and poultry in the Wye Valley, is something they see as a particular problem.
Our findings found that these units were highly concentrated. So to give you an example of that, the majority of England's pig population is housed in just 5 council areas, and just 10 council areas house more than half of England's chickens. And actually, this is really important, and it matters because it presents real difficulties when it comes to the sustainable management of manure from these outputs.
Now, the report is pretty wide-ranging. You also highlight the use of land for growing feed for pigs and poultry, and the report estimates that it takes up 500,000 hectares of farmland and uses over a third of the UK's total wheat crop. Why does that matter?
Yeah, I think this is an issue which kind of we really wanted to draw attention to in this report, because whilst the average area of specialist pig and poultry farms are really quite small, the areas of land required to produce pig and poultry feed extend well beyond the unit footprints themselves. So it takes up a huge amount of land, and most people aren't aware of this. So I think this is a really important point to draw out just from an awareness perspective, because what it means is that as you drive across the British countryside, as you drive past wheat fields, in reality, you're probably driving past intensive pig and poultry farming, in all senses. And actually, one ways in which this is a really key issue to draw on is that the grains produced to feed pig and poultry are often grown in a very high input, high intensive way, because the demand for cheap feed grown with large amounts of inputs, so for example, pesticides and fertilizers, are required to produce for these units. And this risks further pollution, soil degradation, and harms to wildlife.
But we eat a lot of pig meat and we eat a lot of poultry. Chicken is incredibly popular. So what would you suggest that they should be fed on if they're not fed on animal feed that's produced in the UK?
So there's a potential to grow feed to a better quality, but I think in order to do that, what we need to see is far more support for these pig and poultry farmers, because at the moment they're really not in a position to make better, kind of more sustainable choices because of essentially the pricing systems and the supply chain and retailers and how all of that works. The government is currently working up a suite of significant policies, whether that be the land use framework, a farming roadmap, the food strategy, which was recently published. And these will all impact the future of farming in England. And what we want for the findings of this report, and why we're publishing this report now, is that it's critical that these developing policies recognise the scale of the industry's impact and the risks posed to our environmental resilience as a nation.
But also impacts on their pocket as well, more expensive meat for customers.
There is obviously the argument that this will have more impact on supermarket shelves, but in reality, we know that so much of the profits from these products, from these pig and poultry products on supermarket shelves, are actually taken up by the supply chain, by the retailers, by the processors. So actually paying farmers a little bit more for more sustainable practices will only have a really minor impact on the supermarket shelf.
Barnaby Coop from the Wildlife Trusts. Lizzie Wilson is the Chief Executive of the National Pig Association. Kaz asked her what she made of the report.
To be honest, I'm not really sure what they're hoping to achieve with this report, to be honest. The report tells us a lot of what we already know, to be honest. A lot of it isn't a secret, especially sort of the most populated areas with regards to pig for a start. As far as I can see, it doesn't really present us with any compelling evidence with regards to specific pollution issues or incidents to kind of justify their claims, to be honest. Well-managed risks don't equate to negative outcomes.
Do you not think it's useful to have a report that has a really broad overview and looks at the industry in the context of all kinds of other things as well?
Yes, however, there's a lot of kind of big numbers thrown into it and some quite general headlines, but not a lot of the very important context that actually makes it more meaningful and more accurate.
The report talks about the fact that a large area of land is used to produce feed for pigs and poultry.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've got to remember that not all wheat grown actually makes it for milling grade. There is a significant proportion that's downgraded for livestock feed. Otherwise, it's wasted. According to AIC, 30 to 40% of wheat grown for milling actually makes it to the human food supply chain for human consumption. So there's got to be an alternative market there.
This report also addresses the problem of the large volumes of waste that comes from intensive livestock farming. What regulations are you governed by when it comes to disposing of waste or muck?
Well, a number, to be honest. We're potentially one of the most highly regulated sectors throughout agriculture. And actually, we've been told repeatedly by both DEFRA and the Environment Agency that we're not their immediate concern. Pigs and poultry quite often used as an example of the most environmentally responsible sectors. We are environmentally permitted. We are governed by farming rules for water. There's many farms engaged with catchment-sensitive farming. 95% of pigs produced are audited by Red Tractor, who also ensure that all of the legislation, environmental or otherwise, is being complied with.
So obviously you would defend the industry. No improvements needed then?
That's not what I'm saying, no. There's always room for improvement. There's always things that we can do better. There's always a minority of all sectors that aren't as compliant as they should be. And that's why we're continuing to engage with government on their review of all the regulation pertaining to water quality to ensure that we're doing as much as we can and we're being as environmentally responsible as we can be and fulfilling all our responsibilities.
Lizzie Wilson there from the National Pig Association. Changes to the costs, paperwork and bureaucracy that are hampering agri-food exports from Great Britain to the European Union won't be in place until 2027. Back in May, after the UK-EU summit, many farmers and food producers were cheered by the news that a common SPS, that's Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, was on the cards, meaning that, and I quote, the vast majority of movements of animals, animal products, plants and plant products between Great Britain and the EU could be undertaken without certificates or controls. Well, DEFRA figures show that companies spent more than £36 million on export licences for food and farming products to the EU last year, and that doesn't factor in the labour costs and added admin. These costs weren't, of course, incurred when the EU was part of the Union. Earlier this week, the Minister for EU Relations, Nick Symonds, set out his priorities for the future of the UK-EU relationship. In a speech to industry representatives and journalists, he outlined why a reset on regulations and costs for food and farming businesses is one of them.
Let's say you're in the agri-food business, selling your goods to Europe. You will need an export health certificate to transport food across the border. £200. Not a one-off fee, not a fee per lorry, but a fee per consignment. If you are exporting salmon or beef, queuing times for SPS checks, £149 for each shipment. If you're selected for sampling, up to £1,400 per shipment on fees, waiting times and the cost of the product sampled. Companies big and small are crying out for change.
The Minister for EU Relations, Nick Symonds there. Well, negotiators are also seeking agreements on energy, fishing, defence, and they're working towards a youth experience scheme. David Henig is director of the UK Trade Policy Project at the think tank, the European Centre for International Political Economy, as well as an expert advisor to the UK Trade and Business Commission. He was at the event and heard the minister give his speech.
I think there were two things that were new from Nick Symonds. One, that he is targeting a agreement date for negotiations on a food and drink deal with the EU in 2027. We didn't have a date before, and there'd been some hints that the government thought it could be done a lot quicker than that. The second thing we heard is that whilst he may look for exemptions from EU regulations for the UK, he is not going to state in advance any of them to be red lines. So therefore, on areas like, for example, gene editing, we don't know if the UK will get any exemptions from alignment with EU rules.
2027 seems a long way away, but is that actually a realistic timescale for these kinds of negotiations?
Yes, it is realistic. The most recent negotiations between Switzerland and the EU took about 18 months. He also didn't commit to when in 2027, so that could be January, that could be December.
Well, the deal struck in May is based on dynamic alignment with the EU. Just briefly explain what that is.
Dynamic alignment means that the UK will follow EU rules on food and drink, in return for which our product will enter the EU without any checks. Why is it controversial? Because it means the UK following rules set by the EU in which we don't have a final say. We may have some kind of say along the way, but we won't have any vote on it when it comes to these being implemented. And it may go beyond the rules for crops or keeping animals. It may go on to things like environmental rules. We don't actually know the exact scope of this. So that's also why it's controversial. But unless you align your regulations in some way, you are not going to get full free access to the EU market.
Well, the minister was talking about carve-outs, meaning kind of exceptions to this alignment. But Nick Symonds wasn't giving anything away, was he?
He didn't really give anything away on the exceptions. Within the common understanding document that was agreed between the UK and the EU in May, the UK had already got a carve-out for higher levels of animal welfare than the EU, which probably includes live animal exports. So most likely we are going to be able to keep those. On gene editing, I think it will be more a case of the EU's rules are evolving in the direction of the UK, so it will probably be some kind of process towards aligning the two, which will incorporate some of what the UK has passed, but perhaps not all of it. On the import ban on foie gras, I suspect that's not going to be taken forward. This has been a long-term goal for many campaigners, but it's something the government has not done, and I suspect it will be difficult in these talks. There will also be other issues that come up of how we get particular regional conditions recognised for the UK, so there will have to be a lot of detail to work through, and the minister was making it clear he wanted to hear from organisations representing various sectors of agriculture to make sure he knew all of these issues before going into talks.
David Henig from the European Centre for International Political Economy talking to Kaz there. What will this mean then for food and farming businesses? One of those listening to the minister was Charles Bourne, Managing Director of Westways Sausages in Newton Abbot, which exports to the EU. He's also a director of Taste of the West, which promotes food producers across southwest England.
He was very credible, and he did articulate very well some of the issues around lorry drivers being held at checkpoints and people like myself filling in paperwork. But the big disappointment to me was the fact that I think it's the 19th of May, with much fanfare, there was the announcement that we were going to remove SPS checks. And to hear that this is being kicked further down the line until 2027, it just seems that the government might be fighting on too wide a front at this moment. Actually, if SPS checks are the real problem that will remove a lot of the friction in UK trade, then why don't we address some of that? Because the longer it goes on, the resolve of those exporting, and frankly, my very loyal customers in Europe, is being tested.
I know you managed to grab a few words with the minister after his speech. What did you ask him?
I was really just saying, when are we going to see some tangible support for SMEs in our sector? And unfortunately, I got a pretty flat bat response, 2027, and I'm not saying when in 2027.
I mean, I know that the minister has said on the issue of the timescale that the EU has its own processes and structures that need to be in place, and that here a bill would need to go through Parliament, and then there are logistics such as computer systems to be up and running, and that 18 months seems reasonable and realistic. What would you say to that?
I'm saying that break it down into smaller bite-sized chunks and don't try to negotiate on too wide a front, because otherwise it's too difficult. And I think that their response would be, oh, well, we have to do the whole deal. It's one deal or no deal. So I'm just disappointed that the length of time it's taking. Exports are down. Agri-food exports from the UK are 20% down since Brexit. There's weed growing in the yard, and it will make it even more difficult to restart business and to restart relationships. We really need action now to get some benefit, some tangible benefit back to the very important, small and medium-sized enterprises that work in food and drink.
Charles Bourne talking to Kaz Graham there. Now, an update on something we covered some time ago. The Upper Coquet Valley in Northumberland, which was considered too remote to be connected to the national grid, leaving people there reliant on generators. Well, now they're connected. Jo Lonsdale reports.
It's happened.
For the families living in this remote valley winding deep into the Cheviot Hills, this was a moment they thought would never come. The first properties finally have what most of us take for granted, mains electricity. It means from now on, JC Charlton can make a cup of tea while her neighbour Catherine Singer has the washing machine on. Before, it would have overloaded the generator, which powered both homes, costing up to £10,000 a year to run. Hair straighteners, I wouldn't dare put them on if the kettle was on. So it's just, you're not going to have to think so much about what you're using at what point, you're using it.
It is exciting for us because it's what we can do in the future with that as a farm business, and, what different things we can diversify in.
The valley missed out on the electrification programmes of the 20th century, and those living there were always told a connection would be too expensive. But when the decision was made to supply mains electricity to 3 emergency telecommunications masts, an opportunity arose to connect most of the properties too, in a project joint funded by the Home Office and the landowner, the Ministry of Defence.
Because of the masts and because of the MOD, and they've all been able to work together, it's nice to see that side of it.
Getting to this point has taken a long time. The valley is within the Northumberland National Park, and its planning authority initially wanted all the lines buried. A compromise was agreed, with 9 miles carried by poles and 3 miles run underground. For the Anderson family, getting mains power has coincided with them moving back into the farmhouse on the land they've had for generations. But Shona Anderson can hardly believe it's happened, and her son TJ is just delighted to put the generator days behind them.
I was at work. As soon as I finished work, I was straight up, and it was flick the light switch, and I'm like, so is that off the mains, not the generator?
We're sitting at night, the next thing the power would just go off, and have to go out at night and see what's going on. If you couldn't get it fixed, you have to wait for a while and be without power. So just like the olden days, really. Then sometimes generator would just concrete randomly.
Fewer than 50 people live in Upper Coquet Dow, a place where winters can be long and hard, with farms many miles apart. But this is a community where families have lived and helped each other for generations. And all of them will be glad to put their frequent visits to the generator shed behind them.
Joe Lonsdale reporting there. And that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.